Greetings, fellow Polonians and friends, and welcome to our POSSE EDU webinar. I'm Dr. Gene Sokolowski, POSSE EDU president, and our topic is Jewish-Nazi collaboration is excused, Polish collaboration is not. By way of quick background, we at POSSE EDU are an educational organization, and our mission is to educate the American public Sorry, we got a little bit of a glitch there. So we're the American public accurately on key aspects of Polish and Polish-American history, culture, and relevant current events. Our guest speaker is Mr. Jan Peczkis, whom many of you know for his insightful analyses of over 1,800 works by Jewish, Polish, and other authors on historical as well as contemporary Polish-Jewish interrelations. Jan's analyses of the Holocaust literature in particular reveal significant falsifications, misrepresentations, and material omissions about Poland and the Poles, which largely explains why Polish-Jewish relations remain problematic. So Jan, welcome, and thank you for being our guest speaker.
Good evening. Greetings. Glad to be back. There's more to come.
So Jan, for our viewers, I will now go to the cover slide of your presentation. So if you'll give me just a few minutes, we'll get there, and then we can address that. So here we go. Not sure why we got the last slide, but I'm going to start with the first one. Sorry about that. Now, as you see here, there are three URLs. The first is Jan's comprehensive online database website titled Jews and Poles Database. Jan's analyses of the many works that he has reviewed are fully searchable by keyword phrase identifiers as well as by author, book title, or year of publication. And his topic guide provides an extensive list of phrases, each of which directs viewers to the answers of many common questions related to Polish-Jewish relations. The second that you see is his website titled Justice for Polish Victims of the Second World War. And this provides comprehensive information on this topic under various categories, and it does so in a visually oriented format. And at the third URL, you can view our webinars that have been posted to YouTube thus far. So our procedure for the webinar will be as follows. First, we'll show Jan's slide, and then second, while the slide is shown, I'll present a question for that slide or the following slides. And then third, Jan will address the question by discussing in detail that slide or the following slide. So let's go first now, please, to the very first slide. Now, Jan, we have the term communist justice, and we know that communist justice in both the Soviet Union and Poland condemned Poles for Nazi collaboration, regardless of their ability to choose or their agency, as often is said. So in sharp contrast, we see that Jews nowadays get a pass for Nazi collaboration while faulting the Poles for alleged collaboration. So please elaborate for us on this.
All right, certainly, Gene. See, the pattern has been established. There's a maximum Polish guilt and minimum Jewish guilt. All right, it all started under the Soviet Union. Working under the Germans became an all-encompassing term, a nebulous loose category. It could only mean the occupation authorities, the policemen and mayors, village heads worked for the Germans, or in a broader sense that encompassed anyone who had worked in German overseen institutions, including teachers and office clerks. A person who worked as a cook for the Germans could and was tried. Even the village heads didn't, not all of them chose their position under the Germans. Many village heads had not volunteered in the court. The military tribunals from 1944 to 1950, not a single case where such external constraints, pressures, or factors were taken into consideration. The Soviet judiciary did not take into account the circumstances under which people came to be employed by the Germans. Okay, now in Poland, something very similar was modeled after the Soviet courts the August Decree trials. August 31st, 1904, decree that the communist authorities, new communist authorities would punish Nazi collaborators. And what happens in these trials, that Poles were forced by the Germans to do things, and yet they were reckoned guilty. On the left, you see my previous webinar on Jedwabne. In slide 16, I detail in what way these trials were completely unfair, a complete travesty of justice. Jedwabne itself, as I pointed out earlier, it's now accepted that the Germans were present in Jedwabne, contrary to Jan Gross's original lies, but it doesn't matter. There's like an invisible wall between Germans and Poles. The Poles are still fully guilty, even though the Germans are there. It's a preposterous travesty of justice, yet that is exactly what we have. Now, what with the Jews? There was a little bit of a flurry after the war. It died out. And now the general narrative is that Jews are victims. You can't really blame them for anything, that the Jews had absolutely no choice, that the Jews were desperate and all that. So there's really no such thing as a Jewish collaborator. My purpose of this webinar is to show that's absolutely false. Yes, we should blame Jews equally. They're going to blame the Poles. Hell yes, we should go hell for leather and blame the Jews again. There should be no dual morality. Dual morality, look at the top. In the Talmud, it says, if an ox owned by a Jew is gored by an ox owned by a Goy, the Goyish owner has to pay the Jew for the damages. But if an ox that belongs to a Goy is or gored by an ox belonging to a Jew, then the Jewish owner does not have to pay. This is a racist travesty of justice, and that's what we have today, with maximum Polish guilt and minimum Jewish guilt. And it's even worse. Nowadays, the Jews rely on these courts. Archival information has been declassified, and Jews have had a field day going through it and presenting as proving Polish guilt. The way the Poles were forced, the travesty of these communist trials is disregarded, and Poles are fully blamed for it, especially Barbara Engelking, Jan Grabowski, and a couple of others. That's all it is, blaming Poland maximally while letting the Jews slide. I will never put up with this, not if I don't have to. Blame Jews equally. No dual morality, not in the Talmud, and not today. Next slide, please.
Diane, we know that Jews often claim that the Germans forced them to do anything and everything. So in the next 4 slides, explain for us, please, why this is largely untrue.
Okay, Eva Korek got herself in a lot of trouble with the Jewish establishment, much of the academic establishment, by suggesting that the Jews carved out voluntarily service to the Germans by the Judenrats, which is the Jewish councils which the Germans commanded to be established. Well, if you look at the sources, Isaiah Trunk, one of the leading scholars of the Judenrats, he says, first of all, that there's no coordinated way that the Germans and the Jews interacted with the forming the councils, the Judenrats. Some cases it was mostly German directed. Some cases there was a Jewish initiative. So Eva Korek is essentially right. All right, the eastern areas of Poland also saw Jewish initiative in establishing representative bodies that were destined later to become nuclei of the Judenrat. In the town of Ostrowiec, as soon as the Germans came, a few individuals offered to create a Jewish committee. And this happened in other places, accepted in Nowe Miasto, where Jews took the initiative in establishing this Jewish self-government under the Nazis. All right, then after the war, what happened? Nowadays, we have the excuse, everybody knows that the Jews suffered so much, the Jews had no choices. You can't possibly blame them for collaborating. Well, guess what? A lot of Jews who actually went through the Holocaust, they know exactly what it's like trying to survive under the Nazis. They actually lynched many former Judenrat and Jewish police members. They certainly didn't think that these people were simply desperate individuals who had no choice, were so traumatized, so terrorized that they have no responsibility for their actions. And for many years in the state of Israel, there were trials for Jewish collaborators, and they were admitted to be actually collaborators. eventually came to an end about 1965 when the Israeli Supreme Court drew a line under the past and essentially stopped them. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Okay, good. Yeah. All right, here's what happened. Now, there were some cases where the Jews were forced to have a Judenrat. For example, the Jews would not pick anybody for the Judenrat. The Germans would designate the Judenrat, and if those Jews refused, they'd be shot. Okay, in those cases, that was imposed. But in most cases, that's not what happened. In most cases, the Germans eventually gave the command for there to be a Judenrat, but the Jews got a chance to volunteer for it. So there was an appearance of consent here. See, that the Jews had a right, there was Jewish agency. The Jews were not without choices. They had some choice. They were, including the right to refuse. There were Jews who refused their nomination despite German pressure, as well as those who resigned their positions either before or shortly after having been appointed. Yet there were no repercussions in any of these cases. If appointed leaders were to decline their appointments to the Central Board, others would be nominated instead. Thus, even if individuals had refused to take up their designated role, the four Jewish organizations would still have been established. So there wasn't at least an appearance of choice of who would actually do it, and that's the point. The Germans could almost always count on some Jews to voluntarily become part of the Judenrats. Now, had the Jews all refused everywhere to serve the Germans under the Judenrats, it's possible that the Germans would start shooting hostages and force the Judenrat on the Jews under threat of death penalty. But because the Jews volunteered, the Germans never had to show their true colors. They never had to show their cards, because most of the time it was voluntary. Plus, it's interesting to note that not all Jewish communities had Judenrats, okay? It wasn't automatic. So it's possible that in some places, the Jews refused to form Judenrats of any kind, anybody to volunteer for it, and they got away with it, okay? Again, we don't know. This needs further investigation. This is kind of vague and has never been studied, probably, in my opinion, because it does not serve the agenda of the idea that the Jews were totally powerless, that the Jews had to do everything the Germans wanted them to do, and the Jews had no autonomy of any kind. Okay, next slide. Okay, now, even when the Judenrats were formed, the Jews still had some choice in them. They were not merely order fulfillers. The diarist Rosenfeld from the Lodz Ghetto describes a situation where the Judenrat disobeyed the Germans and the Germans backed down. Unbelievable. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Germans were supposed to have iron rule, and the Jews were absolute slaves, absolute puppets, absolute no choices of any kind to make, only to follow order. Ashkenazis, a German, demanded Jewish court in the ghetto imposed to carry out the death penalty. 10 judges resigned. See, they had a right to resign. They had a right to quit. 4 remained. Since then, murder is a matter for the Kripo, the German criminal police, and the German court. So the Germans put up with the Jews defying them, and the Germans took it upon themselves to punish murder through their own courts instead of forcing the Jews to punish it on their own court, on the Jewish courts. All right. So the question that goes, yes, the Jews were wearing handcuffs, but how long were the chains on the handcuff? If it's a very long chain, there's a lot of freedom of motion. Even if it's not absolute, there's some degree of motion as long as the chain is of the handcuffs. That we need to investigate more and find out. But it's manifestly untrue that the Judenrats were merely order fulfillers and the Jews had no choices of any kind to work with. Next slide. Okay, very important point. This is based on the study of Philip Friedman. Philip Friedman was a Polish Jew who survived the Holocaust, and he studied the Judenrats in some detail. And another Holocaust scholar Hilberg, he wrote that there was some choice. In unvarnished language, the councils constituted an expression basically of what remained of the confidence Jews had in Germany, even under the Nazi regime. See, this is heresy. If it was purely Germans imposing their will on the Jews, where the Jews had no choice of any kind, you wouldn't have to, Jews wouldn't have to have any confidence. The Jews would simply follow order. So there was a voluntary aspect to it because the Jews did in fact have some confidence in the Germans. More on this later. And then when the Nazis actually decided to order the formation of the Judenrats, it was their own, they had a lot of experts, Jewish experts who studied what Jews are like and what they think of. They know that the Jews very much want autonomy, be many nations of their own under whoever is ruling. So the Germans were adept in exploiting the idea of Jewish autonomy. Many Jews, both in the ghettos and in the free countries, welcomed the fact that Jewish communities enjoyed internal autonomy. It was regarded as a great thing. There we go, more what Friedman wrote. Within its original jurisdiction, the Judenrat was autonomous. The Jews were granted powers that they never had before. That's pretty strong stuff. The only authority within the borders of the ghetto was the Judenrat and its militia, with a Jewish commander and Jewish officers. Never before had the Jews enjoyed so great a measure of self-government. Wow. Now, in many of the Nazi ghettos, they actually have full untrammeled jurisdiction, even in capital cases. All right, so clearly this was a favor from the Germans. We talked about the Judenwissenschaft, these Jewish experts. Now, if the Germans were simply imposing their will on the Jews, there would be no need for such experts. The Germans simply say what has to be done and what can't be done, and that's it. They just impose it on the Jews. But that's not what happened. The Germans obviously had some sophisticated plan for appealing to the Jews, to their separatism, so they could have these self-government. Okay, so this was a favor from the Germans, and the Jews accepted it. So this is another expression of Jewish separatism. Okay. So for Jews in Poland, it meant that the Jews were pursuing an independent course of politics towards the Germans from the Poles. Expression of Jewish separatism. The Jews are separate from the Poles. The Jews act independently of the Poles. And so a lot of Poles saw it, rightly so, as a Jewish serving separate peace with the Germans. Whereas the Poles never surrendered to the Germans. The Poles never stopped fighting the Germans. The Poles never stopped hating the Germans with every fiber in their body, and never regarded the Germans as anything more than their enemies, never accepted any kind of favor from the German enemy, never accepted any kind of collaboration as government with the enemy. The Jews did. And so that could explain, a lot of Jews complained that the Polish underground was insensitive to the Jewish situation. Well, that might be true. If the Jews are going to do their own thing, make their own separate peace with the Germans, come to terms with the German occupation of Poland, just so they can get advantage of autonomy, then let the Jews be left to their own fate. That's part of it. Now, there's Jewish consequences of accepting favors from the German enemy. Military code says this: you never accept favors from an enemy, because when you do, the enemy seems less of an enemy because he's done something for you, and because the enemy will take advantage of you and use this favor against you, probably get you to give more concessions or to blackmail you. Who knows? The enemy is not doing it out of good faith. The enemy is your enemy. He only wants to harm you. That's all he wants to do. But the Jews just embrace that, this autonomy, this Judenrats. See, to make the Jews partners in their own destruction. That's exactly what happened. So it's a situation like this. The Jews can't be faulted that they were imprisoned in handcuffs, but they can be faulted for the fact that they voluntarily accepted the handcuffs to be put on them. Now, had they refused to accept the handcuffs, it is possible that the Germans would have forced the Judenrats, the Germans would have forced forced the handcuffs on the Jews, but they didn't. They didn't have to, because the vast majority of cases, the Jews went along. They either initiated it or they went along and they picked their own people for the Judenrats. So the Jews have accepted the handcuffs. Why were the Jews deceived? We shall see they're very pro-German, but Jews were deceived because they wanted to be deceived. They wanted very much autonomy at all costs, and that's why they were blind to who the Germans were and what they were going to do. They wanted to be autonomy at all costs, and they got it with fatal consequences. Next.
Now, Jan, again, talking about the Jewish councils or the Judenrat or the Judenrats, they have doubtless been crucial to the success of the German-made Holocaust. So in the next 3 slides, please tell us why this is still a viable argument.
Okay, in my previous webinar on censorship, I talked about Hannah Arendt. She wrote a book exposing and condemning Jewish collaboration. That's through the Judenrats. For that, as I said before, showed before in previous webinar, the Jews have absolutely tried to silence her using very desperate, underhanded methods. Look in my censorship webinar under slides 12 to 15 for details. In this program, we see what she did. She called it out. It was collaboration, and it was really bad because only a few thousand Germans, most of whom furthermore only did office work, were able to send hundreds of thousands of Jews to their deaths. Wherever Jews lived, there were recognized Jewish leaders, and this leadership, almost without exception, cooperated in one way or another, for one reason or another, with the Nazis. The whole truth was that if the Jewish people had been unorganized and leaderless, there would have been chaos and plenty of misery, but the total number of victims could hardly have been between 4.5 and 6 million. Nowadays, it's 6 million. All right, there's some support for that still today, even though we're so far past 1963. Next slide. Okay. First of all, we got to ask the questions, what the Germans really wanted to get out of it. The Germans were not necessarily out to exterminate all Jews back in 1930. That decision was not made in 1941. But they're going to, final solution then meant something drastic will be done to the Jews. They'll all be shipped to Madagascar. They'll all be dumped on Poland, Lublin land. All European Jews will be locked up in German-occupied Poland. Something never before done to Jews will be done one way or another, and it ended up being mostly extermination. All right. Top Nazi Dieter Wislitzeny said, our system is to exterminate the Jews through the Jews. We concentrate the Jews in the ghettos through the Jews. We deport the Jews by the Jews, and we gas the Jews by the Jews. Possibly this followed out of Nazi ideology. Why make such a big deal of it? The idea that Jews are selfish opportunists and they'll do anything to advance themselves. The Jews really have no ethics and no loyalties, and they'll do whatever, whoever pays them the most or whoever puts a little pressure on them, and they'll even turn against other Jews. That's something that should be looked at. Okay, the question what Hannah Arendt wrote, there was an Israeli judge, Chaim Ehrlich, questioned with this. What would have happened if all Jews had decided that no one would accept a position in the Jewish Council, Judenrat, or that the Jewish Council will be dismantled? Apparently, it is a viable idea, notwithstanding some shootings by Germans, those who refused, that the Jews could have refused overall to have Judenrats. And then he echoes what Hannah Arendt said. I believe the Germans have been unable on their own to conduct the annihilation that they carried out. It's hard for me to imagine it, Arya said. Another one. Echoing Arendt's assessment of chaos when a leadership Jewish community would have resulted in fewer casualties. Regardless of the question of whether the Germans could have achieved the goal without Jewish collaboration, then Amora, I knew with this one thing, we should not do the Germans' work for them. So even if it was not true, it would not have helped the Germans kill 6 million Jews. Germans could still have done it another way. It still was wrong. Jews are still morally responsible for collaborating. In doing this, it's the same thing that they do when the Jews blame the Poles. Lots of times we hear this mantra, which is total rubbish, that without the collaboration of locals like Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, the Germans would never have been able to undo the Holocaust. That's absolute bunk. It's not supported by a shred of evidence. Can be that even if there was not a single collaborator for the Germans could still have done the Holocaust. Just more men, put more manpower. Are collaborators the cake, or are they just the icing on the cake? You can have a cake without the icing. You can have a Holocaust of 6 million Jews even without any collaborators at all. But it doesn't work. So then they blame the Poles anyway. You say, well, yeah, but the Poles still helped the Germans, so they're still guilty. And we could do the same thing here. Even if it's not true that the Judenrats made the Holocaust possible, these Jews who collaborated still are guilty. Again, the same standards for all people, and no special rights for Jews or anybody else for that matter. Next slide. Okay, now here's something to could look at. Yitzhak Zuckerman was a top Jew in the Warsaw Ghetto. He wrote a memoir after the war. He really was stung by the Jewish collaboration. He complained, the Germans couldn't have taken the transports to Treblinka without the help of the Jews. Our blame is that we could have delayed the sentence. We could have made it hard for the Germans. We could have forced them to bring 10,000 Germans to do the work done by 2,000 to 3,000 Jewish ghetto police. Now, would that have made a difference? Well, one way to look at it is just how German policies work. Hans Frank, chief, the butcher of Poland, the occupation of Poland, believed that it was an error to murder all the Jews in German territory while the war was on. He made a case for concerning the Poles in an analogous way. See, once again, the Germans did want to exterminate the Poles, just like the Jews, but there was too many Poles for them to be doing it during the war. But Hans Frank believed in with the Jews, even though it was a much smaller group, it's too disruptive of wartime production and other things to do it now. Now, if Jews everywhere had refused to load the Jews on the death trains, refused to have a Judenrat, then it's possible that if there's other Nazis who thought like Hans Frank, it could have tipped the balance toward the Germans postponing the Holocaust until after the war was over, which of course Germany would never have won. And so Germany would never have been able to follow through and exterminate the Jews any more than she was able to follow through and exterminate the Poles, because such a circumstance never arose and Germany lost the war. So Hannah Arendt's argument is still viable, at least in that way. It needs further investigation. Next slide.
Now, Jan, we know that Jews have many canned excuses for their past collaboration with the Germans, and these excuses, of course, are never granted to the Poles for collaboration, least of all granted by Jews. Please reveal some of these excuses and also the double standard behind them.
Okay, when the Jews excuse their collaboration, probably say, well, the Holocaust was so terrible that no peoples can ever be judged for collaborating under such circumstances. All Jews were victims of the Nazis, so it's meaningless to talk about collaborators in an environment like that. And that's bunk. It's backwards thinking, as we shall see. Even when these trials were going on in Israel, they came up with some very lame excuses. One was the top. Well, no Jew ever became a Nazi, and no Jew, no matter how well he served the Germans, would ever be accepted by the Nazis as a fellow Nazi. That's nonsense. The vast majority of collaborators of all nationalities did not become Nazis, and nor were they accepted by the Nazis as fellow Nazis because of that. Then one Jewish judge said there was a power disparity. There's no contract between someone like Eichmann and Kastner because of the power disparity between the Germans and the Jews. Hello, power disparity. All nations suffered from power disparity. The Germans conquered all those they did, and people were in total terror, totally defenseless from the Germans. So that was true with Poles, of course, but we never hear about that. The power disparity that led to Polish collaboration or anything else. We never hear about that. Then we hear another creative act of nonsense, that Auschwitz was on another planet. For the Jews it was. I never hear that said about the Poles or any other nationalities. It's another self-serving Judeo-centric invention. The idea being that normal morality does not apply. normal sense of right and wrong and dealing with people don't apply, and therefore for Jews, collaboration is okay because there is no morality. Well, under German occupation, other places, for other peoples also, by the same logic, morality does not apply. It doesn't exist anymore. And so Poles should be excused for their collaboration too. Then there's a nice one Jews say all the time: it prevented a worse situation. It's better for the Jews to be handled by other Jews than to be handled by the Germans. Well, any collaborator can make that excuse. The Poles could possibly have done it too. Maybe if there was a Quisling government, a collaborationist government, that would be less severe on the Poles than a direct German rule, which exists. But the Poles would not go for that. Okay, another thing we could say, when the Jews blame Poles for sometimes killing fugitive Jews, even when the Germans were not watching, Poles could argue also that prevented a worse situation. If the Poles had not killed those Jews, then the Germans could have visited the villages themselves, found and killed all these Jews and more, and then also killed a lot of Poles and possibly destroyed the village. The idea was Poles could say, we prevented a worse situation, better to kill a few Jews and to leave this, so the Germans leave these villages alone, than for the Germans to have a punitive expedition and come in, kill a lot of Jews and a lot of Poles too. I never hear Poles making such an argument. Maybe they should, because the Jews make this exculpatory argument all the time. Then we have another exculpatory formulations. For example, in Israeli Supreme Court, well, we can't really judge these people because we haven't walked in their shoes, which is kind of ironic because most of the accusers of these Jewish collaborators were other Jews who went through the Holocaust and who know exactly what it's like to be a Jew going through the Holocaust and trying to survive. But the argument went anyway. You can say that, of course, with all collaborators. We can't fully, what would you have done in this situation? What would I have done in this situation? Who am I to judge? Who are we to judge? That's the thing. We never hear that about Polish collaborators. The Jews blame Polish collaborators, exaggerated all the time anyway. No such considerations come that we shouldn't judge them. We don't know what they went through. We can't understand the pressures, the unbelievable pressures that they face. And there's this whole idea of the gray zone. That means, I guess, this idea that it's neither collaboration nor voluntary. It's kind of like in a gray area, which may be technically true, but that's true for all collaborators, including Polish collaborators, went through a gray area where things were not clearly right nor clearly wrong, clearly collaboration or clearly not collaboration. And the Jews also make up a big deal out of choiceless choices. Their favorite one, they play on emotions. Like they say, a group of Jews was hiding from the Germans. A baby started crying. So they had two horrible choices to make, a choiceless one. One would be to strangle the baby before its cries give away the hiding place to the Germans, or let the baby continue crying and possibly alert the Germans to the hiding place, in which case all the Jews would die. And of course, never to that's true. All peoples went through choiceless choices. I found a comparable case with Poles. We recently celebrated the 81st anniversary of the Warsaw Uprising. In it, both Polish soldiers and civilians were crossing to other parts of the city through sewers. In one such case, there was a child who started screaming or crying, and it was really bad, especially because noise really carries in sewers. And so if the Germans heard it, they would know where the Poles are in the sewers, and they throw some grenades in there. So the Poles were in a similar choiceless choice situation where they could have been forced to kill the child rather than give away their hiding, give away their places to the Germans. It didn't lead that case to death, but it was a comparable situation. But of course, we never hear about this kind of choiceless choice. Or a Pole who fell, a Pole in the underground, fell in German hands. He was tortured by the Gestapo, and eventually the Germans made him an offer. If he joins the Germans and becomes a spy for the Germans, an informer, the Germans will stop torturing him and they won't kill him, won't send him to a concentration camp. But if he refuses, then the Germans will kill him or send him to a concentration camp. What will he do? What would you do? Choiceless choices. But if we only care about the Jewish ones, we never care about the ones from other people. Then, of course, there's the all-purpose one. Fear of the Nazis, But of course, that's true. All people were afraid of the Nazis. It doesn't excuse their collaboration. And no, as I shall say, it is not a special excuse for the Jews. Jews did not have a special right to be fearing the Nazis, as we shall see. It's backwards thinking that they knew they were going to be exterminated, so they have a special fear of the Nazis and a special excuse for collaborating. They don't, as I shall say. I should show. Again, we've got to avoid this minimalist Jewish guilt, maximalist Polish guilt. Next slide.
Now, Jan, we know that the sycophantic Jewish conduct toward the Germans, both in the Judenrats and then elsewhere, this further alienated Jews from the Poles. So please explain for us how this occurred.
Okay, it's commonly taught that the early post-war years, we talked about Jewish passivity, and the Jews resisted that, saying, well, so you're saying we're cowards because we didn't fight. No, it wasn't that at all. It was because, as we shall see, Jews were very pro-German. It was an obsequiousness. There was 2 German documents which talk about German soldiers being ordered closely watch captive Poles and Russians, while they can be lenient with the Jews, that the Jews will not resist or try to run away. Then escapee, fugitive Jew encountered a Jewish work gang with no German guards around with. The Germans trust us because the Jews are obsequious. And then another situation, incident near Bergen-Belsen. We weren't closely supervised. The Germans thought that non-Jewish prisoners were more likely to escape, so only Jews worked at night. So Jews weren't passive because they were cowardly. No, they were not cowardly. They were passive because they were very obsequious to the Germans. Now, and what this had to do, okay? Poles, of course, were even more turned off from the Jews, that the Jews are not fighting the Germans. The Jews have no kind of spirit of opposition to the Germans. And the Jews have made a separate peace with the Germans, even more likely for the Poles legitimately not to care too much what happened later to the Jews. Then when the Jews did want to fight, like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, years later, the Poles understandably had a hard time taking seriously these claims because this long history of Jewish obsequiousness to the Germans as such. Next.
Now, Jan, we know that Jewish authors reflexively invoke, as you said before, the, quote, fear of the Nazis, unquote, argument. And they use that as an excuse for their collaboration with the Nazis. So in the next 4 slides, explain for us why this argument is largely invalid.
Yes, well, we never hear about this. We get the idea we've been led to believe that the Jews were immediately afraid from the Nazis from day one. The Nazis were in power. They were mortified. They made foolish choices. They were totally intimidated, totally demoralized by what the Nazis were about to do. And so their collaboration is excused. It is not. A lot of Jewish sources say at the time they didn't think that Germans were really bad. No one was yet aware what the Germans were preparing for the Jews. And then a lot of Jews believed they can handle the Nazis from massive bribes to the Gestapo. And in the past, the Jews have gotten away with a lot of difficult Gentile governments by paying them hefty bribes. Another Jew wrote, anyone talking about the Nazi crematoria at that time would have been laughed at. Okay, nor is it true that Judenrats sending Jews on trains meant that they were being sent to their deaths. Some councilmen were forced to draw up lists of people demanded by Nazis for deportation to the east. Although due to their captors' efforts at secrecy, it was rarely clear that this meant certain death. So for a long time, the Judenrat was shipping people to on German orders without knowing where they were, and it was usually for labor. This actually came up in a court case where Judenrat made a Jewish ghetto policeman on trial made the argument that he was just trying to save his life, to save the life of other Jews by sending other Jews away. The judge did not accept it, just because previously, 2 years earlier, long before the Holocaust itself, the Jews were sending other Jews on German orders to unknown destinations for labor, and it didn't scare them. Okay, so and since the Jews did not know where these Jews were being shipped to, they couldn't have known that they were going to be murdered, and so they're not excused. The Jewish ghetto police are not excused by letting Jews go this way. All right, even in 1942, when the Holocaust was full swing, the Jews were still deluding themselves that Hitler in his rage was using his threats as propaganda to shift the blame for German debacles on the front. The old scapegoat trick that the Jews are just scapegoats and that he'd just be making these threats in order to solve his conscience for losing the battles and things like that. Jews are scapegoats, that meant. Okay, Jews at the beginning of the time of the resettlements in July 1994, death of Ruka, believed German claims about their benign nature. Another Jew wrote, up until this year, we had no reason to believe that the persecutions that Germans were not carrying out and the special laws they had passed against us were intended to wipe us all out, everyone. Not one of us suspected that the final aim of the Nazis was our physical extermination and wholesale annihilation of the Jewish race. None of us could reasonably think such a thing possible. That's pretty strong. I have a much bigger selection of proof that the Jews were very, very, apart from being terrified of the Nazis, were very, very slow to realize what the Nazis were really going to do. Next slide. Okay. This whole idea of the Jews being pro-German is very much ingrained. You can go on my website, look under Jewish Germanophilia. I have lots and lots of entries going far back centuries, how the Jews are very strongly pro-German. Now, in 1939, a whole bunch of Jews collaborated with the invading Soviets. And the canned excuse they give that they were happy to fall under Soviet rule because the Germans would kill them. So anything was better than falling under the hands of the Nazis. That sounds nice, but that's nonsense. See, many Jews who entered Soviet territory later returned to their homes under Nazi occupation. Some even crossed the border several times, unsure as where they would fare better, okay? This blows this argument out of the water. The Jews are not especially afraid of the Nazis. If they were, it's self-evident that anything would be better than being a Jew under the Nazis, but that's not how they thought. A lot of them voluntarily returned back to Nazi-held territory. Now, of course, there was some news about what the Nazis had already done to the Jews, but the Jews didn't want to hear it. No pre-Holocaust Jewish awfulization of Nazi anti-Jewish policies. Let's see, one wrote, we just heard about the German persecutions, but most of us didn't believe it. That is, this removal of Jews from their positions of power and privilege in Germany. There was Kristallnacht, the night of the broken crystals. There, of course, several thousand Jews were shot by the Germans and massacres and burnt in synagogues in the 1939 war. But for some reason, this did not impress the Jews. The Jews did not thereby acquire a special fear of the Nazis. They're still in denial. See, among themselves, Hashem or Chatzar members noted the fact that Hitler had been in power in Germany for 6 years and that nothing terrible had happened to the Jews there. See? And then even more, another one. We shrugged off and expressed doubt when various newspapers told us what was being done to Jews in Berlin and other cities. Each of us chuckled skeptically. Oh, good. So our writers are amply endowed with the spice of imagination. Yeah, really. Okay, what does all this Jewish Germanophilia mean? For many generations, East European Jews had looked to Berlin as the symbol of law, order, and culture. The Jews were too stupid to understand their situation. Alexander Donat said that in response to Polish warnings, how the Jews would not listen to him and how he considers fellow Jews stupid for not listening to the warnings and believing so much in the goodness of the Germans. Next slide. Okay. Now, some more testimonies as the Holocaust was actually beginning. No one willingly joined the transports, but no one could or wanted to imagine what was happening in the extermination camps. Okay, so the idea was it's not good to be transported somewhere else, but that does not mean the Jews transported somewhere else or being sent to their death. No one wanted to imagine it. SSJ, no SSJ, that's the save some Jews argument. They later made a claim that the Judenrats first sent some Jews to their deaths because they wanted to save the remainder of the Jews. And that's bunk because A lot of them for a long time did not believe they were sending Jews to their deaths. And because, as I said before, the Judenrat had sent Jews to other destinations, which were for labors. So that was the same thing. Later, the Jews made up a story like this, that Rabbi Moses Maimonides had an account. It was 10 Jews. Some guys approached them and said, you have a choice. You either tell this, turn this one to us and we'll kill him and we'll let the other 9 of you go. But if you don't turn him over to us, then we will kill all 10 of you. And that's what they thought of the Nazis. That's not the way it happened. For that to be comparable, it would have to be this. It would have to be Germans show up in a ghetto, call all the Jews together. Hey, folks, guess what? We're going to kill you all. But here's the thing. You have a choice. If you, a choiceless choice. If you cooperate with us and load all these Jews to the trains, we'll let 100 of you stay alive. But if you refuse to load the Jews on the trains to the death camps, then we'll just kill you all. That would have been comparable. Clear threat in a clear situation like that described by Moses Maimonides. That's not what the Germans did. They gradually deported Jews to places following the same deportation they did earlier that did not lead to the death of Jews, like for workplaces. So the results are not comparable, and therefore the Jews don't have a save some Jews excuse. We have to save some Jews, so let other Jews die. That's not what happened. The Jews were unsuspecting what was happening, and they thought they were doing nothing any really different from sending Jews to labor as they did earlier. Okay, then let's go on. All right, Warsaw Jews disbelieved Treblinka. Not only that, even in Warsaw, Vilna, Białystok, and Lwów, reports of death journeys were discredited for a long time. That's in Hilberg, Holocaust scholar. At the time, however, people could not imagine it because they did not believe, even the Nazis were capable of such atrocities. Then, most of the Jews going to the gas chambers had no inkling what was happening there. When they arrived in places like Auschwitz and they got off the trains, they didn't start wailing and pleading with the Germans to spare their lives. No, they just thought they believed this line about they're about to take showers, and in most cases they thought they're just going to take a shower, were totally unsuspecting. So obviously they had no prior fear of the Nazis at least being sent to death, because that's why they obediently went to the gas chambers, with rare exceptions that they never resisted. Not only that, but even some farcical situations happened. For example, in France, there was a poodle brought by French Jews to Auschwitz. That's how normal they thought everything was. They had no idea, no concept of what the Germans were about to do to them, because they believed so much in the Germans. Okay, people could not bring themselves to believe the Germans, coming from one of the most civilized countries in the world, could be capable of such horrors. Any news of it was met with incredulity, or at most ascribed to the savagery of a local commander. So when the news started filtering in, they tried to explain it away in margin. Oh, it's maybe just one vicious commander. This isn't normal of the Germans. The Germans are basically good people. Just one vicious guy who did it. Marginalize it. And then he asked the question, why didn't the Warsaw Ghetto uprising happen much sooner? Well, why was the revolt delayed? The answer is well known and cruel. After every transport, after every action, those who remained consoled themselves that now the beast of prey had satisfied itself. Okay, so when some Jews, far from being mortally afraid of a Jews being sent to the death, even if they did believe that, they thought it would soon come in. The Germans are good people. This business of killing Jews, the Germans will soon get over it and stop doing it. There's no point in revolting. There's no point in resisting the Germans. And of course, it also shoots down that argument. We have to send some Jews to their death in order to save the best Jews, because these Jews believe it would stop anyway, that the Germans would stop killing Jews at some point. Don't revolt, don't resist, and there's no need to try to save the life of any Jew. That's not an excuse then. Okay, over a year later, after most of the Jews had been killed, some Jews still didn't believe in Łódź Ghetto. A factory manager, Jakub Poznański, September 1943, unbelievable. A year later, persistent rumors circulating in the ghettos about liquidation of ghettos in various Polish towns. Even if excess has occurred in some towns, this does not mean by a long shot that the Jews were being murdered in masses. marginalized with a vengeance. Here, Jews have already been killed, and he's still explaining this away as being isolated acts. The Germans are basically good people, even if there were some bad commanders who killed some Jews here and there. This couldn't have been on a large scale, even though most Jews were actually already gone. Finally, here we go at the end, conclusion. Who could believe that these proper, upright, hardworking people would commit mass murder? Even now, when we know that it is true, we still can't get used to the idea. Stubborn resistance to contrary facts to the age-old Jewish Germanophilia. This also is cognitive dissonance, okay? This partly explains Jewish Polonophobia. Earlier in previous webinars, I had said that Jews are prone to blame Poles rather than Germans because the Germans paid them and paid them a favor to leave them alone. And because this is why the Jews also dichotomized between Nazis and Germans. The Germans were basically good people, just a few rotten apples. But there's another reason for it too, because the Jews have such an ingrained Germanophilia, the cognitive dissonance. They don't want to face the fact that the Germans did the Holocaust. They'd rather blame it on somebody else, blame it on the Nazis, blame Christianity for the Holocaust instead of the Germans, and blame the Poles, which is what we face all the time, unfortunately, with no end in sight. Next slide. Okay, now excuse that the Jews were sending people to their death camps to save their lives. Now, in a few cases that did happen, the Germans gave the orders for the Jews to be put on the ship to unknown destinations, and the Jews balked. The ghetto police refused to load them on the trains. Then the Germans started shooting hostages. That happened in a few cases, but in most cases it didn't happen. The ghetto police just loaded the Jews up to the trains, just as they did it previously at previous other times. Here was a testimony of a Jewish ghetto policeman in which ghetto, why he became a ghetto policeman. It wasn't to save his life. In a ghetto filled with nobodies, you were somebody. We received special ration cards. Aha, larger rations, better quality food. Yeah, exactly right. Favors from the Germans by collaboration. No standing in a long line. And then part didn't have to be worried about being deported. But as we knew at that time, deportation was not desirable, but it was not synonymous with fear of death. So fear of death is not an excuse for deporting other people. And avoid getting by itself, avoid being deported oneself. And we didn't have to perform physical labor, another favor. Okay, here he describes what was thought. Convenience, unequal self-preservation. We didn't know where the transports went. We didn't know about the gas vans and gas chambers. So a person could pretend it was just a new work assignment, just like all these shipments of Jews months and years earlier had been to work assignments elsewhere, and certainly not to their deaths. Most people in Lodz had never even heard of it, so Auschwitz meant nothing to us, okay? So you can't use that as an excuse, in this case, as an excuse trying to save his life, because they had no concept of people put on trains losing their lives, and just it was not convenient to be sent to another place to an unknown destination, but that's not the same thing as saving your own life by not being on that transport and by sending somebody else. And then this idea of saving some Jews, Judenrats sending some Jews to their deaths so that the best Jews can survive. Again, they had no such concept that sending Jews on trains itself is synonymous with sending them to their deaths. And therefore does not follow that the Jews will remain, or therefore just merely trying to save the best Jews. All right, so save some Jews. No, doesn't happen. There was an Israeli judge in the trial in 1964, I think, of Jewish ghetto policeman Hirsch Barenblatt. He said that this is the excuse that Barenblatt gave, that it was like a gangrened arm. It's better to cut off a gangrened arm so you can live than live with a gangrened arm and then die entirely. And so, of course, that's with a false argument that the Jews could get a gangrene arm that could be sent away just so other Jews can live. And he rejected that. The decision as to what part of the people were still considered a gangrened arm is synonymous with the decision of who's superior to whom. Egoistic intentions to preserve themselves, their families, and close friends, okay? But as we said, this preservation is dubious because they had not much of a conception of Jews dying. They were sent to other places. and things like that, as I have said. Next slide.
Mayan, we're going back to the fear of the Nazis argument. And as you said, this is one that's actively promoted by Jewish authors, but it also applies to Poles. And it may seem almost ironic that they too had an equal fear of the Germans. So please explain for us this seemingly counterintuitive fact.
Yeah, that's the idea was that the Poles hardly suffered at all. They lived almost normal lives. The Jews were mortally afraid from the beginning. And any Jew who escaped the ghettos among the Poles was mortally afraid of being killed, and the Poles were just easygoing, normalized nonsense. Here we have some testimony of several Polish Jews who escaped the ghettos, escaped the Germans, and they were just as afraid of being killed as Poles as they were about their Jewishness being discovered that they would be killed as Jews. See, did not guarantee me any security. I could be shot. He was afraid of being caught both as a Jew and a Pole. I had to share the dangers faced by all Poles, of course. So in this risk, in the individual level, Poles and Jews were equal victims. They were equally afraid of dying at the hands of the Germans, which is yet another reason why Holocaust supremacy should be dethroned and torn down and thrown in a rubbish heap of history. And Poles and Jews, all victims should be equal, even in some way. Not in a group sense, no, we're not saying that, but in an individual sense, all victims are equal. You should be treated that way. Next slide.
Now, we know that for their own selfish benefit, Jewish collaborators often far exceeded the Germans' orders, and by doing so, they acquired money for themselves. So in the next 3 slides, please give us some examples of this shameful behavior.
Okay, some of these Jewish collaborators were very, very high status. Okay, there was a guy, he had was a collaborator, influence with the Gestapo, whatever I had to say. He had his own automobile, his own chauffeur. The militia did not feel that they were merely functionaries to execute what was demanded of them. They also felt that they were a better, more important people. Okay, power and privilege. That's another aspect of collaboration. The Jews certainly fitted that in some way. Next slide. Okay, we hear much about how all the time about how the Germans used Poles against Jews, but it happened the other way around. One time, the Germans wanted to hang some Poles. They wanted some Jews to do it. They told the Jews to appoint 2 men to do the hanging for them, but they were, except for Jew Morris and a Jew from Slovakia. They went because they knew they'd get good food and better conditions for doing so. See, they collaborated with the Germans and hanged the Poles, not because their lives were threatened, but because they would get benefits and favors for doing that. Okay, now, nowadays, Jews complain a lot about Poles getting the property that once belonged to the Jews and try to extort reparations money for it, even though this is a long settled issue 80 years ago. And every nation, you have a property transfer. It's completely legal. Polish acquisition of Jewish property is completely legal, not an issue. Even the Jews are making. Ironically, it happened the other way around. There was a Sonderkommando. His job was to burn the bodies in Auschwitz and the crematories, and periodically, not every time, but periodically, some of the Sonderkommandos were killed, so there would be no Jewish eyewitnesses. Okay, so once Sonderkommando dead, people in the Sonderkommando traded the various items they found in their undressing hall. They did business. They bartered with people on the outside. The Jews brought the belongings, and those that went to work outside the camp sold them to the Poles who lived in the area. So you have these Sonderkommandos, which have tons and tons of Jewish clothing and Jewish belongings, taking it, profiteering from it, selling it to the Poles. And they only complain about the Poles and not the Jews who actually sold these things. The Sonderkommando. Next slide. Okay, now, the Jewish police profited in ways beyond what the Germans required them to do. All right, they became police by volunteering, by having advantageous contacts, sometimes being randomly conscripted by the Nazi authorities. And the Kovno ghetto police all were formed at the Jewish initiative, not just Jewish volunteers, but the very act of the police was from German initiative. Okay, and nor did it begin when the Jews were traumatized and terrorized by the Holocaust. See, Emanuel Ringelblum of the Warsaw Ghetto wrote, the Jewish police had a very bad name even before the resettlement. Jewish policemen also distinguished themselves with their fearful corruption and immorality. Okay, now, lots of times, the Germans required the Judenrat and Jewish ghetto police to confiscate something from the Jews and give it to the Germans. For example, the winter of 1941-1942. The winter came earlier. The Soviet Union did not collapse as had been expected by the end of 1941. And so the Germans had to ship a whole bunch of fur coats to the soldiers on the Eastern Front who were freezing their buns off in the vicious Russian winter. The Jewish ghetto police was forced to requisition various coats and shoes for the Germans. In doing so, it also confiscated additional items for themselves. So in addition to taking what the Germans required, they also take things for their own pocket, for their own profit. At other times, the Jewish police confiscated the Jews' items for themselves without even the pretense of German authorization. They just stole from the Jews. Lots of different testimonies I've read about Jews complaining about the Jewish ghetto police, enriching themselves, doing something the Germans never ordered them to do, to benefit. Okay, let's then consider violence. It was a case where in a post-war Israeli trial, where a capo was accused of beating Jews. A Jewish capo was accused of beating Jews. His defense was, it's a nice one, clever one. He just wanted to impress the Germans about what a good job he's doing so the Germans would spare his life. That's bunk. A couple of those places, the Jewish police did physical violence against the population. More importantly, they did so not only when Germans were watching, but also when no Germans were present. So that excuse falls apart. And say, also in the Israeli capo trial, Jewish capos beat other Jews even when the Germans were not watching. There was no need to impress the Germans with this kind of anti-Jewish violence. Yet they did it on their own, out of their own cruelty. Next slide.
Yeah, and lastly, explain why Jewish profiteering did motivate the Judenrat to dispatch some Jews to their death camps while avoiding deportation themselves.
Okay, earlier we said that the excuse for the Judenrat and ghetto police sending some Jews to death camp was that they were trying to save their own lives by not being sent to the camps themselves, and because they wanted this gangrene arm. They wanted to cut some Jews away so that the remaining Jews, including surprise themselves, would be the future of Judaism. They would survive. And that there's another motive that has been identified in that. First of all, it was invalid because they did not know where, for most part, where the trains were being sent. And because, so they could not have known that they're saving their lives by sending other Jews on these trains. And also they could not possibly have known that they are saving the best part of the Jewish community by sending other Jews away. No. So why did they do it? We're happy to live at the expense of those who are taken. This is a horrible truth, but it is the truth. It's profiteering. The Jews wanted to make money off those other Jews that were sent supposedly to labor, but actually to their deaths, okay? It was not save some Jews, it was save some money for themselves. Even more explicit, Shirakowiak on Luj Ghetto. There are people in the ghetto who have already set aside little fortunes for after the war, particularly Jewish cripple agents. Okay, said they think they're gonna survive the war and they want to make big money off the Jews that were killed. Profiteering. Okay, then other times, so they did it, they did acts again when they were not ordered by the Germans. In Vilnius. The Jewish police are more German than the Germans. The Germans were once ordered first taken. They took what they could and it calmed down. But the Jewish police never rest. Just yesterday, they uncovered a radio on 15 first. They went with a diligence beyond that they were required by the Germans. On more than one occasion, Judenrat took advantage of the opportunity to help the town by extorting money for their own purposes. All right. It was not all force. Among the Jewish population, there were some deluded individuals for the sake of personal immunity from arrest, a better labor card, the beggar ration would gladly turn informers, okay? To benefit at the expense of the countrymen, this classic collaboration. In Belarus, and those who assisted the Nazis when forming on and betraying other Jews often did so voluntarily in order to receive monetary rewards, power, and status. That we had this before, power and status, and monetary rewards. So it's not all involuntary. So even these Jewish spies, some of them were voluntary. In Germany, Jewish collaborators were at times recruited by the Gestapo without other torture or pressure of any kind. So it's not all involuntary. It is high time that Jewish collaboration be equally faced or not explained away or excused or covered up and just all the blame put on Polish collaborators. Until this changes, I myself will not stand for it. Okay, this concludes my presentation. Good night. Show him.
Yeah.
You gotta keep us
Yeah,
fit.
let me
Feel
with
great
the
Poland.
closing remarks. As we come to a close on our webinar, we at POSSE EDU thank you for your interest in our webinars. And Jan, thank you for explaining why the Jewish councils, the Judenrats, were crucial to the success of the German-made Holocaust. We also saw how the reflexive, quote, fear of the Nazis argument was used by Jewish authors as an excuse for Jewish collaboration with the Germans. And we saw that that is clearly mostly invalid. And lastly, we saw examples about how Jews deepened their collaboration by going well beyond German orders for their own selfish benefit and by using their positions of power over other Jews. And so with that, we thank our viewers for your interest and we bid you all do widzenia and goodbye.
France.